the poor rancher saved two giant Apache twins. That night, they whispered they wanted him together. John Herrera had always lived a quiet life. His ranch, a small stretch of land in the Arizona desert, was barely enough to support him, but it was all he had. The land had been in his family for generations, passed down from his father, who had taught him everything about cattle, fences, and survival in the harsh desert. John had grown up surrounded by wide open spaces, the endless blue sky and the rugged beauty of red rocks and cacti. There was a loneliness in the desert, a silence that pressed on the ears and the heart, but John had learned to live with it. Despite his hard work, the ranch was not prosperous. The sun was unforgiving, summers were scorching, and water was always scarce. Some years his cattle barely survived the heat, and some years a sudden storm would wash away the little feed he had. John knew how to make do with what he had, though, but for the right season to wait for the right season, and to make every drop of water and every blade of grass count. He loved the land in a quiet, steady way, even when it was difficult. One afternoon, John was walking along the edge of his property, repairing a broken fence. A sudden gust of hot wind rattled the dry wooden posts, and the sun beat down hard on his back. Sweat ran down his face, and the dirt under his boots was cracked and dusty. As he hammered a loose plank into place, he heard a strange noise, soft, almost like crying. At first he thought it was the wind moving through the rocks, but then he heard it again, a low, muffled sound, not quite human, not quite animal. Curiosity got the better of him. John had always been a man who helped when he could, whether it was a neighbor in need or an animal in trouble. He set down his tools and followed the sound toward a narrow canyon near the edge of his land. The canyon was steep, with rocks jutting out at sharp angles, and it was easy to slip if he wasn't careful. He moved slowly, testing every foothold, scanning the shadows for the source of the sound. As he approached, he noticed something unusual. Two figures, enormous in size, were trapped in a shallow cave at the bottom of the canyon. At first, he thought he was imagining things. They were unlike any humans he had ever seen. Their shoulders were broad, their arms long and strong, and their bodies were massive. It was clear they had been caught in the cave by a sudden landslide, rocks piled high around them. They were struggling to free themselves, but every movement only seemed to make the situation worse. John's heart pounded. He had no idea who, or what, these creatures were, but he knew he couldn't leave them there. The sun was sinking, and the shadows in the canyon were growing longer. He thought about his options. He didn't have any special equipment, no rope long enough to pull them out, no machine to move the rocks. He only had himself, a shovel, and the determination that had kept him going through many hard years on the ranch. He climbed down carefully, sliding on loose gravel, and called out gently, "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help." The figures froze for a moment, their heads turning toward him. Their eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion. John could see the bruises on their arms and legs, the blood from small cuts on their skin. He swallowed hard. These giants, he realized they were twins, were in serious danger, and he had to act fast. He started by digging around the rocks that trapped them. Sweat poured down his face as he moved the heavy stones, one by one. The twins watched him, tense and silent, unsure whether to trust this small man who seemed so fragile compared to them. Every now and then, one of them tried to push against the rocks themselves, but their strength only caused more rocks to shift dangerously. John had to guide them, speaking calmly, showing them what to do. "Slowly, carefully," he said. "We'll get you out, just stay still." The work was exhausting. The desert heat made his head spin, and the dust got in his eyes and mouth. At times he thought about giving up, telling himself that maybe he couldn't do it alone. But every time he looked at the twins, he saw fear and pain, and he couldn't leave them there. He thought about how his father had taught him that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about doing the right thing even when you were scared. Hours passed. The twins began to trust him little by little. They stopped thrashing against the rocks and followed his directions. When John instructed them to lift a smaller stone while he moved a bigger one, they obeyed. Their faces showed relief, but also a strange sense of wonder at this man who was so small, yet so determined. John didn't know their language, but their gestures and expressions were enough to understand that they were grateful, even if they couldn't say it in words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last rock shifted. The twins pushed together, and with a final effort, they were free. They stood up slowly, testing their limbs, and looked at John. Their size was intimidating, but there was a softness in their eyes. John wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a step back, not sure what they would do next. He had saved them, but he knew the night in the desert could be dangerous for anyone, especially for two strangers who couldn't speak and had no shelter. "Come with me," John said gently. "I'll give you water. You can rest at my ranch." At first, the twins hesitated. They glanced at the canyon behind them, and then at the open desert. Finally, they nodded slightly and began to follow him. Their steps were careful, almost reverent, as if they were entering a new world. John led the way, making sure they didn't stumble, and carried his shovel like a walking stick. The walk back to the ranch was quiet. The twins didn't speak, but their presence was heavy and powerful. The desert was turning dark, and the first stars began to appear in the sky. The wind rustled the dry brush, and the coyotes howled in the distance. John felt a mixture of fear and awe. He had never encountered anything like this before, and he wondered what these giants would do once they reached his home. When they finally arrived at the ranch, John guided them to a shaded area near the barn. He filled an old trough with water, and the twins drank, slowly, carefully, as if they were savoring something precious. John watched them, noticing the deep lines of exhaustion on their faces. He had never seen anyone so big, so fragile, at the same time. He fetched blankets and made a simple place for them to rest, using whatever he had on the ranch. That night, as John sat by the fire, he thought about the strange twist his life had taken. He had always known the desert could be harsh and unforgiving, but he had never expected to find beings like these twins. He wondered who they were, where they had come from, and why they had been trapped in the canyon. He didn't have answers, but he had a certainty deep in his heart that he had done the right thing. The desert night was quiet now, the stars shining brightly above. The twins slept, their massive bodies curled up near the barn, and John felt a strange connection to them. He realized that life on the ranch would never be the same. The loneliness he had known for so long was being replaced by something entirely new, a bond that he couldn't yet understand, but that he felt with every heartbeat. John finally leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He knew that tomorrow would bring challenges, and that taking care of these giants would not be easy. But he also knew that he had discovered something extraordinary in the middle of the desert, something that would change his life forever. And for the first time in a long while, he felt hope and the quiet thrill of an adventure that had just begun. The morning sun rose slowly over John Herrera's small ranch, painting the desert in soft shades of orange and gold. The air was still cool, but the heat of the day would soon come, and John knew it would be another long day of hard work. Yet, when he opened his eyes, he realized that the quiet morning held a new sense of urgency and curiosity. The two giant twins were awake, standing near the barn. Their massive frames cast long shadows across the dry ground. John could feel their eyes on him, watching every move he made, their expressions cautious, almost wary. He approached them slowly, holding out his hands in a gesture of peace. "Good morning," he said softly. "You rested well?" They only nodded, their eyes wide, and one of them made a small gesture, pointing toward the water trough. John understood immediately. They were thirsty again. He walked over, filled the trough, and waited patiently as the giants drank deeply. Watching them, John realized how fragile their situation still was. Even though they were enormous and strong, their trust was fragile, and they needed care and guidance. John knew he had to feed them, but he also had to think carefully. The twins were enormous eaters, far beyond the size of ordinary humans. He went into his modest kitchen, thinking quickly. He had some vegetables, a few sacks of grain, and leftover meat from his cattle, but it would barely be enough. Still, he did what he could. He chopped vegetables into large pieces and cooked a simple stew. The smell reached the twins, and they moved closer, their curiosity slowly replacing their fear. As they ate, John noticed their behavior. They were quiet, watching him closely, speaking in soft tones to each other that he didn't understand. But there was a rhythm to their communication, a sense that they were planning or discussing something important. John felt a mix of fascination and worry. He realized that these twins were not ordinary people. Their strength was enormous, but there was also intelligence and caution in every action they took. Once they had eaten, John decided to inspect his property. The twins followed him, moving carefully so as not to damage anything. He showed them the fences, the barn, and the small stable where his few cattle grazed. They observed everything with sharp attention, almost as if they were learning quickly. One of them gently touched a fence post, testing its strength, and John realized that they were not just curious. They were assessing the land, trying to understand how it worked. The day wore on, and the twins' trust in John grew slowly. He decided it was time to help them clean the dirt and bruises from the landslide. He filled a large tub with water from his well and guided them to it. One by one they stepped in, the water reaching up to their knees, and John gently washed their skin, removing dirt and small cuts. They shivered at first, unused to the sensation, but soon relaxed under his careful touch. He noticed the subtle expressions of relief on their faces, and a quiet bond began forming between them and the man who had saved their lives. But John also faced challenges. The twins were powerful, and even small movements could destroy fragile parts of his property. A single misstep could crush a fence or overturn a water trough. John had to guide them carefully, speaking in calm tones, showing them how to move gently. At first, it was exhausting. He was constantly on edge, worried that one wrong move could cause disaster. Yet slowly, the twins learned to adjust to his guidance, listening to his words and following his instructions with surprising patience. As the afternoon approached, John noticed a new problem. The twins needed shelter. They couldn't stay outside in the desert sun. It was far too hot, and there was no protection from the wind, which could carry sand and small debris that might hurt them. John thought quickly. His barn was small, but it could hold them if he moved some of his supplies aside. He spent hours clearing space, shifting sacks of feed and repairing broken beams to make sure the structure could withstand the weight of the giants. The twins helped as best as they could, moving objects with careful strength, working in harmony with John. The barn was larger in appearance, almost magical in the way it accommodated the twins. John lit a small fire outside to cook another meal. The twins sat quietly nearby, their massive forms outlined by the flickering flames. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at John, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and something he couldn't yet understand. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, a combination of relief, pride, and wonder. He had saved them, and now they were beginning to trust him. As night fell, the desert became alive with sound. Crickets chirped, the wind rustled through the cacti, and distant howls echoed from far-off hills. John noticed that the twins seemed more alert at night, their senses sharp and watchful. They whispered to each other in low tones, sometimes glancing at John as if inviting him into their conversation. He didn't understand the words, but he felt their intention. They were sharing something important. There was a sense of urgency, of need, that John couldn't ignore. Later, as the fire burned low, one of the twins stepped closer to John. He gestured toward the empty space next to him, then pointed at himself, and then at the other twin. John felt a shiver run down his spine. He realized they were asking him to stay near them, to be part of their world, not just as a caretaker, but as someone who belonged with them. It was an unusual request, one that he could barely comprehend. He hesitated, unsure if he should accept, but he felt a deep sense of trust growing between them. The twins lay down to sleep, but their presence was still overwhelming. Their size, their strength, and the mysterious connection they seemed to want with John filled the air with an almost magical tension. He sat by the fire, thinking about what the day had revealed. These were not ordinary beings. They had intelligence, emotion, and a desire for companionship that was unusual, even for humans. John realized that his life, which had been quiet and predictable, had suddenly changed in ways he could never have imagined. During the night, a soft wind blew through the desert. John listened to the whispers of the twins, trying to understand the rhythm of their voices. Though he didn't know the words, he could feel the meaning behind them. They were expressing gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, a desire for connection, for trust, and for safety. John felt honored and nervous at the same time. He had saved them from the canyon, but now they were inviting him into a world he could barely understand. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, John knew he had a decision to make. He could continue his simple life, tending to his small ranch, or he could embrace the unknown, accept the twins as companions, and enter a life full of mystery, responsibility, and perhaps danger. He realized that this was not just about survival, it was about trust, loyalty, and the extraordinary bond between beings from different worlds. John took a deep breath, feeling the cool desert air fill his lungs. He looked at the twins, sleeping peacefully in the barn, and felt a strange sense of calm. He knew the coming days would be difficult. Feeding them, providing shelter, and understanding their needs would require all of his strength and patience. But he also knew that he could not turn away. He had rescued them from the canyon, and now they had chosen him as part of their lives. The twins stirred as the sun rose higher. They looked at John with a quiet expectation. He understood that their world was vast and mysterious, and he was only beginning to glimpse it. Yet he felt a sense of purpose, a new chapter of life that promised adventure, connection, and the chance to be part of something extraordinary. The day ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long while, John felt truly alive. The desert stretched endlessly around the ranch, quiet and beautiful, full of challenges and secrets. John knew that caring for the twins would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. But he also knew that life without trust and connection had been lonely, and this new bond, strange, magical, and powerful, was worth every challenge. He smiled faintly, Feeling the warmth of the fire and the quiet trust of the twins, the adventure had only just begun, and he was ready to face it, step by step, day by day, in the heart of the vast, mysterious desert. The desert was quiet that evening, but John Herrera could feel tension in the air. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the cacti and carrying a faint dry scent of sand. He glanced at the twins who stood near the barn, their large forms outlined against the fading orange sky. They were alert, almost watchful, their eyes scanning the horizon. John knew that they had learned to sense danger in ways humans could not. He felt a mix of awe and unease. Something about the desert that night made him feel that a challenge was coming. A test not just of his strength, but of the bond he shared with the twins. John had spent the day preparing the ranch. He reinforced fences, secured the barn doors, and moved feed sacks to safer areas. The twins had worked alongside him, their massive hands carefully handling objects that would have crushed ordinary humans. John marveled at their precision and care. Even with their size and strength, they had learned to act gently when needed, guided by a respect for the man who had saved them. There was something almost magical in the way they worked together, a silent communication that John was only beginning to understand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a distant rumble reached John's ears. At first he thought it was a trick of the wind, but the sound grew louder, rolling across the desert like a warning. The twins stiffened, glancing at each other and then at John. Their expressions were tense, serious. John's heart raced. He did not know what was coming, but he trusted that the twins could sense it better than he could. Their instincts had been honed by survival in the harshest conditions. Suddenly the sky darkened as a sandstorm swept across the desert. The wind rose in powerful gusts, carrying dust and debris that stung the skin and made it hard to see. John ran to the barn, shouting for the twins to follow. They moved with surprising speed and coordination, their large bodies cutting through the wind like living shields. John felt the force of the storm pressing against him, but he held his ground, determined to protect the ranch and the twins. Inside the barn, the chaos continued. The storm shook the wooden walls, rattling the roof and whipping loose objects across the floor. John struggled to secure the doors while the twins moved instinctively, holding up beams and protecting the fragile structures from collapse. Their whispers filled the barn, urgent but calm, and John realized they were coordinating their efforts with him. Despite their size and power, there was a gentleness in the way they moved, an understanding that force alone could not solve the problem. As the storm raged on, a large beam fell from the roof. John jumped aside, barely avoiding it, and the twins reacted instantly. One grabbed the beam with both hands, lifting it with ease, while the other moved debris away to clear the space. John watched in awe as they worked together, not just with strength, but with intelligence and precision. They were protecting him as much as they were protecting the barn. In that moment, he understood the depth of their connection. They were no longer just creatures he had rescued. They were his allies, his companions, and in a strange way, his family. The storm seemed endless. Hours passed, and the wind howled like a wild animal. John's arms ached from holding doors and securing objects, but he never faltered. The twins stayed close, whispering softly, moving with coordination and care. At one point, a heavy gust threatened to blow over a water trough, and John barely managed to grab it in time. One of the twins reached out, steadying it with ease. Their presence was reassuring, almost comforting, as if they were telling him, "We are here. You are not alone." Amid the chaos, John felt a strange sense of clarity. He realized that this was more than a storm. It was a test of trust, courage, and unity. The twins had chosen him as part of their world, And now, in the face of danger, he was proving himself to them. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, trusting, and depending on him. It was a bond that went beyond words, a connection forged through survival, care, and mutual respect. Hours into the storm, a loud crack echoed through the barn. Part of the roof had begun to give way under the pressure. John's heart leapt into his throat. He shouted to the twins, but they were already reacting. One twin lifted the collapsing roof beam with enormous strength, holding it in place, while the other moved to reinforce the structure with nearby planks. John assisted where he could, working alongside them as if they were one being. Together they stabilized the barn, preventing it from collapsing completely. As the storm began to subside, John noticed something remarkable. The twins, despite their exhaustion, were still attentive to him. They guided him through the barn, checking each corner for damage, making sure he was safe. Their whispers continued, low and urgent, but there was a softness in their tone now, a reassurance, a recognition that they had survived the worst together. John felt a wave of gratitude and awe. He had witnessed their power, their intelligence, and their care, and he understood that this night had changed everything. When the storm finally passed, the desert was quiet again. The sky cleared, revealing stars that shone brighter than John had ever seen. The twins stood near the barn, their massive forms silhouetted against the night sky. John looked at them and realized that their whispers were no longer urgent. They were gentle, intimate, almost reverent. Though he could not understand their words, he could feel the meaning. They were expressing something beyond gratitude. They wanted him with them, not just as a helper or friend, but as part of their world, fully and completely. John felt a mixture of fear, wonder, and joy. This was not a request that could be taken lightly. To accept it meant embracing a life far beyond the ordinary, a life full of mystery, responsibility, and the unknown. Yet he also felt a deep sense of belonging. He had spent so many years in solitude, facing hardships alone, and now he was being invited into a bond that transcended loneliness. The twins had chosen him, and he could not turn away. That night, as the desert cooled and the stars sparkled above, John sat near the twins. Their whispers filled the air, rhythmic and soothing, and he realized that they were sharing their world with him. He listened carefully, sensing their emotions, understanding their intent, even without knowing the words. There was trust, care, and an unspoken promise of protection and companionship. John felt honored, humbled, and deeply connected. The twins lay down near him, their massive forms stretching across the barn floor. John felt the weight of the moment. The storm had tested them all, and they had survived together. He realized that the bond between them was now unbreakable, forged through shared danger, trust, and care. The twins had shown him a strength that was both physical and emotional, a power tempered by wisdom and empathy. John felt a deep respect for them, and they, in turn, seemed to recognize his courage, patience, and heart. As he closed his eyes, John reflected on the night's events. The storm had been terrifying, exhausting, and dangerous, but it had also revealed something extraordinary. The twins were not only survivors, they were guides, protectors, and companions. And he, too, had proven himself, showing courage, resilience, and an ability to connect with beings far beyond the ordinary. In that quiet desert night, John felt a sense of purpose, belonging, and wonder that he had never known before. By dawn, the barn was battered but standing. John walked around, inspecting the damage with the twins by his side. Together they cleared debris, repaired broken beams, and ensured that the ranch was safe once more. The twins moved with surprising delicacy, careful not to cause further damage, and John marveled at their awareness and intelligence. He realized that this partnership was more than survival. It was a deep, mutual trust and respect that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As the first light of morning touched the desert, John stood near the twins, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. They had survived the storm together, and in doing so, they had deepened their bond. John understood that the whispers he had heard the previous night were not just words. They were an invitation, a request for connection, and a declaration of trust. The twins wanted him as part of their world, and he was ready to accept. The desert was quiet again, the storm now a memory, leaving only the soft glow of dawn and the sound of wind moving gently through the cacti. John looked at the twins, their eyes reflecting the first rays of sunlight, and felt a deep sense of awe. This was a moment of transformation, a turning point in his life. He had saved the twins from danger, but in doing so, they had also saved him from loneliness, from isolation, and from a life of quiet routine. John took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. He knew that life on the ranch would never be the same. The twins had changed everything. They had shown him a world of strength, intelligence, care, and connection that he had never imagined. And he had accepted their invitation, ready to walk with them into the unknown, side by side, bound by trust, courage, and an extraordinary bond that no storm could break. The morning sun rose slowly over John Herrera's ranch, casting a warm, golden light across the desert. The air was calm, and for the first time in days, the wind did not carry the sharp sting of sand or the distant rumble of a storm. John stepped outside the barn and looked around, taking in the familiar landscape, the wide stretches of land, the red rocks, the small patches of grass where his cattle grazed. Yet, everything felt different now. The ranch had been transformed by more than the storm. It had been transformed by the presence of the twins, by the bond that had formed between them over the past days. The twins were awake, stretching their enormous bodies and moving with a careful grace that John had come to admire. They watched him as he walked toward them, their eyes calm and steady. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a connection that needed no words. John could feel it in the way they moved, in the way they glanced at him, in the soft whispers they exchanged that he could not understand but somehow felt in his heart. They were not just creatures he had saved. They were companions, friends, and family in a way that transcended ordinary life. John decided it was time to begin the day's work. The storm had left the land battered, and there was much to do. Fences needed repairing, the barn needed reinforcement, and the water troughs had to be refilled. The twins followed him closely, moving with precision and care. Their strength, which had once seemed almost dangerous, was now a blessing. They lifted heavy beams, carried large sacks of feed, and helped stabilize broken fences, all under John's guidance. It was remarkable to watch how quickly they had adapted to life on the ranch, learning not just the physical tasks, but also the need for gentleness and patience. As they worked, John reflected on the journey they had shared. He had discovered the twins in a canyon, trapped and afraid, and had risked his own safety to rescue them. They had followed him to the ranch, learning to trust him, and together they had faced a terrifying storm that had tested their courage, strength, and unity. Through it all, John had realized that the bond he shared with them was rare and extraordinary. It was built on trust, respect, care, and an unspoken understanding that each would protect the other, no matter the cost. By midday, the work was well underway. John paused to take a drink of water, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The twins sat nearby, watching him with an intensity that was both comforting and awe-inspiring. John realized that their gaze was not one of threat or suspicion. It was one of connection. They had come to rely on him as he had relied on them. Their bond had grown stronger with every shared task, every whispered conversation, and every challenge they had faced together. It was a bond that would not be broken by distance, danger, or time. After a brief rest, John suggested they explore the land beyond the ranch. He wanted the twins to understand the full extent of their surroundings and to feel a sense of freedom and connection to the desert that had been both their home and their prison. They moved carefully together, walking past familiar landmarks, over rocky terrain, and through small valleys where wild plants grew. The twins observed everything with keen eyes, taking in the details of the land, the sky, and the distant mountains. John could see the curiosity and wonder in their expressions, and he felt a quiet pride in guiding them through this new life. As they reached a small hill overlooking the ranch, John paused and looked at the twins. The view was breathtaking. The desert stretched endlessly, bathed in the soft light of afternoon, with shadows dancing across the rocks and the distant mountains. The twins stood side by side, their massive forms silhouetted against the sky. They whispered to each other softly, and John felt a warmth in his chest. Though he could not understand their language, he felt their meaning: gratitude, trust, and a desire to include him fully in their world. The twins gestured for him to sit with them. He obeyed, settling on the warm earth between them. The wind brushed against their skin, carrying the scent of desert plants and the promise of calm. John realized that in this moment, he was not just a rancher or a rescuer. He was part of a bond that transcended ordinary life. The twins had invited him into their world, and he had accepted. He felt a sense of belonging, a feeling he had not known in years, and it was both comforting and exhilarating. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple, the twins stood and moved closer to John. They whispered once more, their voices soft and rhythmic. He did not understand the words, but he felt the intention behind them. They wanted him near, wanted him to be part of their lives in a way that was profound and lasting. John felt a shiver run through him, not of fear, but of wonder. He realized that he had been given a gift beyond measure, the trust and companionship of beings who were extraordinary, powerful, and deeply connected to him. Night fell over the desert, bringing with it a peaceful calm. The twins lay down near the barn, their massive forms stretching out under the starry sky. John joined them, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath him and the quiet presence of his companions beside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely at peace. The challenges of the storm, the hardships of the ranch, and the loneliness of years past seemed distant, replaced by the presence of these extraordinary beings who had become his family. In the days that followed, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. John, the twins, and even the animals adjusted to the unusual household. The twins learned quickly, helping with chores, understanding the land, and even caring for the smaller animals with surprising gentleness. John marveled at how seamlessly they adapted, how their strength was balanced by intelligence, and how their presence brought a new energy and vitality to the ranch. Each day was filled with small adventures, discoveries, and moments of quiet wonder. One evening, as they all sat near the fire, John reflected on the journey that had brought them together. The canyon where he had found the twins seemed like a distant memory, a moment of fear and uncertainty that had led to an extraordinary friendship. He realized that life had a way of surprising those who were willing to take risks and show courage. By helping the twins, he had not only saved their lives, but had also transformed his own. He had discovered a connection that was rare and profound, a bond that would endure through all challenges. The twins whispered softly that night, as they often did, their voices carrying a rhythm that John had begun to understand. Though the words were foreign, the meaning was clear. Trust, companionship, and a desire to remain together. John smiled, feeling a warmth in his heart. He had found a family in the most unexpected of ways, and he knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The desert night was calm and quiet, the stars shining like scattered jewels across the sky. John lay back, feeling the warmth of the twins beside him and the sense of peace that had finally settled over the ranch. He realized that life had given him something extraordinary, the chance to be part of a bond that was deeper than words, stronger than fear, and more powerful than loneliness. The twins had chosen him, and he had chosen them. Together they were a family, bound not just by survival, but by trust, care, and a shared journey that had begun in the canyon and would continue for years to come. As dawn approached, John watched the first light touch the desert. He felt hope, joy, and a quiet certainty that life would continue in this extraordinary way. The twins stirred, whispering softly, and John felt their intention once more, to remain together, connected and united. He reached out, touching one of their hands gently, and felt the warmth and strength of their bond. The journey that had begun with fear and uncertainty had led to a profound discovery that trust, courage, and care could create a family in the most unexpected of ways. John knew that life on the ranch would not always be easy. There would be storms, challenges, and moments of uncertainty, but he also knew that they would face everything together. The twins were not just companions. They were family, and he was part of their world as much as they were part of his. The ranch, once a lonely and quiet place, was now filled with laughter, whispers, and the extraordinary presence of beings who had changed his life forever. In the quiet moments of the morning, John smiled as he watched the twins move gracefully across the ranch, tending to tasks, exploring, and protecting their new home. He felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known, a connection that transcended the ordinary, and a deep gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought them together. The canyon, the storm, and the rescue were all part of a journey that had led to this moment, a life filled with wonder, companionship, and the extraordinary bond of beings who had chosen each other. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden glow across the desert, John realized that he had found something rare and priceless: family, friendship, and a sense of belonging that was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The twins whispered once more, their voices carrying a rhythm that resonated with his heart, and he knew without doubt that they would remain together forever. In the vast, endless desert, amidst the beauty and challenges of the land, John had discovered a life filled with trust, love, and the quiet magic of being chosen.